I learned early that fear could be polished into obedience. I wore silk, I carried a name, and I swallowed everything I felt. Love was never forbidden. It was simply never offered. What I was prepared for would cost more than anyone admitted. Each morning inside the palace followed the same careful rhythm: stone corridors, lowered eyes, words chosen as if they might wound. I was taught to stand still while decisions were made around me, to smile while futures were arranged like pieces on a board. Meals were formal. Affection was measured. Even silence had rules. Beyond the windows, banners shifted with the wind, and rumors of war moved faster than prayer. I told myself this was normal. I told myself I was ready. I was raised for power, not for love. That truth was not spoken aloud in the palace where I grew, but it lived in every corridor, every bowed head, every silence that followed my footsteps. I learned it before I learned mercy, before I learned how to want. I am the firstborn of a crown forged by war. My father used to say our blood was older than the stones beneath the palace, that it remembered conquest the way the body remembers pain. When I was a child, I believed him. I believed that power was a birthright, as natural as breath. Love, however, was never mentioned with the same certainty. The palace was a place of ritual rather than warmth. Mornings began with the sound of bells and servants moving like shadows. Afternoons were measured by lessons in history, diplomacy, and restraint. Evenings belonged to my father's council, their voices echoing through closed doors, while I sat alone, waiting to be summoned or dismissed. My mother existed at the edges of my memory. She died when I was young, though no one ever told me how. Her name was spoken carefully, like a fragile object that might shatter if handled too openly. I remember her hands more than her face. They were always cold, always steady. She once told me that fear was not weakness but awareness, that to fear was to understand what could be lost. I did not understand then how much I would lose. From my earliest years, I was taught to watch rather than speak, to listen for what was not said. The court was filled with smiling faces and hidden intentions, and my tutors insisted that a future ruler must learn to read both with equal precision. I learned which nobles bowed too deeply, which ones lingered too long in conversation, which names my father never spoke without tightening his jaw. Among them was Lord Halric. He was my father's closest advisor, a man whose loyalty was celebrated openly, and whose presence filled every chamber he entered. He had a voice that commanded attention and eyes that never stopped calculating. When he smiled at me, it felt rehearsed, as though he were practicing for a moment yet to come. "You will rule one day," he told me when I was barely old enough to hold a blade. "And when you do, remember that kindness is a luxury. Power must never hesitate." My father nodded at those words. I did not. Fear began quietly. It did not arrive as terror or panic, but as a constant awareness that every choice I made was already being weighed by others, that my future had been drafted long before I could object. I was afraid not of death, but of becoming something I did not recognize. Family in the palace was duty disguised as blood. My younger sister, Elaine, was the only one who spoke to me without calculation. She was softer than I was allowed to be, her laughter untrained, her defiance unpolished. She would sneak into my chambers late at night, bringing stories from the servants' quarters, tales of ordinary lives untouched by council decrees and borders drawn in blood. "They love," she once whispered as though confessing a crime. "They choose each other." I said nothing. I did not know how to respond to the idea of choice. My father ruled with a controlled distance. He was never cruel, but never gentle. His affection, when it came, was measured. A nod of approval, a hand on the shoulder after a successful recitation of law or lineage. He spoke of legacy often, of how our kingdom stood because previous rulers had sacrificed comfort for stability. "You will be asked to give up much," he told me one evening, standing beside the high windows that overlooked the city. "But remember this, a ruler's happiness is irrelevant. Only the survival of the crown matters." That was the night I understood that love would one day be demanded of me, not offered. The first whisper of war came during a winter council. I was seated behind my father, silent, expected to observe rather than participate. Messengers had arrived from the eastern border, their cloaks stained with mud, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They spoke of troops gathering beyond the hills, of alliances forming quietly, of old treaties being questioned. War was not declared, not yet, but fear thickened the air. The council debated strategies, resources, marriages, always marriages. Names were spoken as though they were weapons, unions proposed as shields against invasion. When one noble suggested my name, the room fell into a brief, reverent silence. I felt my breath stop. My father did not look at me. He simply said, "It will be discussed." That night, I could not sleep. I walked the palace corridors alone, my footsteps echoing against stone. Every portrait I passed seemed to watch me with expectation. Kings and queens stared down from gilded frames, their eyes filled with certainty I did not possess. None of them looked happy. All of them looked remembered. I found myself in the lower gardens, where the scent of winter flowers clung stubbornly to the cold air. That was where I saw her. She was not meant to be there, not at that hour, not alone. Her name was Isolde. She was the daughter of a lesser house, one whose lands bordered the eastern territories, now threatening war. She had been brought to court months earlier, a gesture of goodwill or perhaps insurance. I had seen her before, across crowded halls, standing beside her father with practiced grace, but I had never spoken to her. That night she stood beneath the bare branches of an old tree, her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders. When she noticed me, she stiffened, then bowed. "Your Highness." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. They held the same fear I carried, unmasked and unguarded. "You should not be here," I said, the words automatic. "Neither should you," she replied. The honesty startled me. We stood in silence, the kind that feels dangerous because it invites truth. I wanted to ask her why she looked as though she were waiting for a sentence to be passed. I wanted to tell her that I felt the same. Instead, I said nothing. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "They say my family's loyalty is being tested." I understood what she meant. Loyalty was another word for sacrifice. "I am sorry," I said. It was the first apology I could remember offering without obligation. She studied my face as though searching for something. "So am I." We did not touch. We did not promise anything. Yet when we parted, something had shifted within me. A crack, small but undeniable. I knew even then that whatever war was coming would not only be fought on fields and borders, it would be fought within families, within hearts trained not to feel. And I was afraid, not of the enemy gathering beyond our lands, but of what the crown would demand of me when the time came. Fear does not announce itself. It settles. It learns the shape of your thoughts and waits there. After that night in the gardens, I could not forget Isolde's face. Not because of beauty alone, though she possessed a quiet grace, but because she looked at me without reverence, without expectation. She looked at me as one frightened soul recognizing another. That frightened me more than any blade. In the days that followed, my life resumed its rigid structure. Lessons at dawn, councils at midday, evenings spent listening to my father speak of borders and grain stores, of alliances measured in dowries and blood. Yet beneath every word, something unspoken pulsed. The question of my future, the price I would be asked to pay. Love and duty began to pull at me like opposing tides. I saw Isolde often after that, always in public spaces, always surrounded by watchful eyes. We exchanged no words, only glances that lingered a fraction longer than propriety allowed. Each time I felt as though I were committing a quiet betrayal, not of the crown, but of the person I was expected to become. My sister noticed before anyone else. "You look as though you're carrying something heavy," Elaine said one evening as we shared a meal in my chambers. She pushed food around her plate, uninterested, watching me instead. "Or someone." I stiffened. "Careful." She smiled faintly. "I am careful. That's why I see it." Elaine had always been dangerous in that way. Too perceptive, too honest. She had not been shaped for rule, and perhaps that was why she understood its cost so clearly. "They will marry you," she continued softly, "won't they?" "Yes." To her, I did not answer. That was answer enough. Elaine's gaze dropped. "Do you care for her?" The question struck deeper than I expected. Care was not a word used lightly in the palace. It implied choice, attachment, weakness. "I don't know," I said, and hated myself for the uncertainty. "You should," she replied, "before they decide for you." My father summoned me the following week. His solo was a place of order. Every object had its purpose. Every tapestry told a story of victory or sacrifice. He stood by the window when I entered, hands clasped behind his back, staring out over the city he ruled. "You are of age," he said without preamble, "and the realm grows restless. Yes, father, the Eastern lords test our borders. They look for fractures, weakness." He turned then, his gaze sharp. "They will find none." I knew what was coming. My heart began to pound, slow and heavy. "Marriage," he said, "is a declaration as much as an alliance. We must choose carefully." "Isolde," I said before I could stop myself. His expression did not change, but something darkened behind his eyes. "You have noticed her," he said. "She is already here. Her family's loyalty is uncertain," he interrupted, "which is precisely why this is dangerous." Lord Halric emerged from the shadows near the wall, as though summoned by my father's hesitation. I had not noticed him there. I rarely did, until it was too late. "Dangerous," Halric repeated, "but effective. Her marriage would bind her house to us irrevocably. Should her kin betray the crown, her life would stand as collateral." I felt something twist violently inside my chest. "She is not a hostage," I said. Halric smiled thinly. "All marriages are, Your Highness. Some are simply more honest about it." My father watched me closely. "You hesitate." "I consider," I replied. "There is a difference." He studied me for a long moment. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when I believed I could rule without sacrifice. I believed love might be preserved, protected from politics." His voice hardened. "I was wrong. I thought of my mother, of the cold steadiness of her hands, of her quiet disappearance from my life." "What happened to her?" I asked suddenly. The room froze. Halric's eyes flicked to my father, warning, calculating. My father did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was controlled. "She fulfilled her duty." That was all he would say. I left the solo with my questions unanswered and my resolve fractured. That night, I sought Isolde again. We met by chance, or so it appeared, in the long gallery where portraits of former queens lined the walls. She stood before one, studying it with a thoughtful expression. When she heard my footsteps, she turned. "You shouldn't be here," she said, echoing our first exchange. "Neither should you." A faint smile touched her lips, brief and sad. "They are discussing my future," she said quietly. I thought I should meet the past. I stood beside her, facing the painted woman, whose crown seemed too heavy for her slender neck. "Do you know her story?" "Yes," Isolde replied. "She married to prevent a war. It worked, for a time. And then she died young. The words hung between us. They speak of us as if it is decided, she continued, as if we are pieces already placed. They speak that way of everyone, I said, especially those closest to the crown. She turned to me then, her gaze unwavering. Do you believe it must be that way? The honesty of the question stripped me bare. I was raised to believe I have no choice, I said, that wanting something beyond duty is indulgence. And do you believe that? She asked. I wanted to say yes. It would have been easier, cleaner. But fear loosened my tongue. No, I said. I believe it is cruel. Her breath caught, just slightly. For what it is worth, she said. I am afraid, too. We stood too close. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of her through layers of fabric and expectation. For a moment, I imagined what it might be like to choose her. Not as an alliance, not as a shield against war, but as a woman who understood fear because she lived with it as I did. Then footsteps echoed down the corridor. We stepped apart instantly. Lord Halric appeared, his presence filling the space like smoke. Your Highness, he said smoothly, you are needed. His gaze flicked to Isolde, assessing, measuring. Lady Isolde, I trust you are settling well. Yes, my lord, she replied, perfectly composed. As I followed him away, I felt the weight of his satisfaction. He had seen enough. Later, Elaine confronted me again. They are watching you, she said urgently. Halric especially. He smiles too much when your name is spoken. He always has. No, she said, not like this. He wants something. Everyone wants something. She gripped my sleeve. I'm serious. Father listens to him more than he should. That frightened me more than any rumor of war. Halric was not bound by blood. His loyalty was spoken of, not proven, and yet his influence stretched into every decision. That night, alone in my chambers, I faced the truth I had been avoiding. If I married Isolde, I might save thousands of lives. I might prevent a war before it began. But I would also turn her into a living guarantee, a threat against her own blood. If I refused, the Eastern Lords would see weakness, the borders would burn, and my father would look at me not as an heir, but as a liability. Love and duty were no longer abstract concepts. They were names, faces, consequences. Fear pressed in on all sides, not fear of loss alone, but fear of legacy, of becoming a ruler remembered only for the wars I failed to prevent or the hearts I broke to secure peace. I understood then that no choice would leave me innocent, and the war had not yet even begun. The council chamber was built to intimidate. High ceilings, narrow windows, stone walls that absorbed sound and returned it heavier. Every meeting held there felt less like discussion and more like judgment. By the time Act 3 began, the pressure was no longer subtle. I was summoned not as an observer, but as a presence. My seat was placed closer to my father's throne now, a visible reminder to everyone that my role was shifting. Eyes followed me as I entered, some with hope, some with calculation, some with something colder. Lord Halric stood at the center of the chamber, speaking before I arrived, his voice carrying with practiced ease. The Eastern houses do not deny their troop movements, he was saying. They claim they are defensive, preparatory, but we all know what that means. It means they expect weakness, one of the dukes replied. And they sense it, Halric continued smoothly, because we have not yet answered their provocation with certainty. My father raised a hand. We will not be rushed into war by rumor. No, Halric agreed, but neither should we allow uncertainty to grow. History shows us that hesitation invites bloodshed. I took my seat. The chair felt heavier than before. Halric's gaze found mine almost immediately. He inclined his head slightly, as though including me in the argument, as though this was already my burden to share. The proposed marriage, he said, would be a declaration. It would tell the Eastern lords that their borders are bound to ours by blood, not just ink. "And if they rebel anyway?" another councillor asked. Halric did not hesitate. "Then they would condemn their own daughter to be branded traitor by association, a powerful deterrent." I felt my jaw tighten. My father remained silent, watching the room, letting the argument unfold, letting the pressure build. "She is not a weapon," I said. The chamber stilled. Several heads turned, some startled, some displeased. Halric's expression remained calm. "No one suggests she is, only that her position carries weight. She is a person," I replied, "with a family, with loyalties that existed long before we summoned her here." "Which is precisely the problem," Halric said gently. "Divided loyalties are dangerous in times of war." My father finally spoke. "Enough! This council will not debate morality. We will debate survival." I looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the weight he carried, the years of compromise, the decisions that had hollowed him out slowly, quietly. "This is not only about the East," he continued. "Other houses watch us. They will measure our resolve by what we do next." "And if I refuse?" I asked. The question echoed. My father did not answer immediately. Halric did. "Then the realm pays the price," he said, "in blood, in famine, in broken borders. And history will remember that it was avoidable." I understood then how this would be framed, how every possible outcome would be written before it happened. The council adjourned with no formal decision, but the conclusion lingered in the air. I had been placed on a narrow path, bordered by expectation and fear, with no room to step aside. Afterward, my father asked me to walk with him. We moved through the inner corridors, past tapestries depicting victories that had cost thousands of lives. He did not speak until we were alone. "You challenge Halric openly now," he said. "He speaks as though people are expendable," I replied. "They are," my father said quietly, "in war. And before it," I pressed. "Are they expendable then too?" He stopped walking, turned to face me. "You think I do not see what this costs?" he asked. "You think I do not remember what it was like to want something different? Then why do this?" I asked. "Because wanting is not ruling," he said, "and because I learned too late that love does not stop armies." The words struck with practiced precision. He had told himself this story for years. Perhaps he needed to believe it. "You were not raised for love," he continued. "You were raised to endure, to choose the lesser ruin." "And if I cannot?" I asked. His gaze hardened. "Then you will not be ready to wear the crown." That night, I did not sleep. I found Isolde in the small chapel near the western wing, a place rarely used except by those seeking quiet rather than ceremony. She knelt alone, hands clasped, her head bowed. When she sensed me, she rose. "They've decided," she said, "not officially." She smiled without humor. "Officially means nothing here." I closed the distance between us, lowering my voice. "You do not have to accept." Her eyes searched mine. "Do you truly believe that?" I wanted to lie. I did not. "They will ask you," I said, "and they will expect obedience." "They expect obedience from you as well," she replied. "Yet here you are." I hesitated. "If this happens, it will not be because I wanted to bind you." "I know," she said softly. "That may be what frightens me most." We sat on one of the stone benches, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. The air smelled of old incense and stone. "My father," she said after a moment, "believes this marriage would protect our lands. And you?" "I believe it would destroy them," she said. "If war comes, my family will be seen as traitors regardless of what they do, loyal to you or loyal to their blood. Either way, they lose." Her honesty cut deeper than accusation. "I'm sorry," I said again. It felt inadequate. She turned to me fully. Tell me the truth, not as a prince, as a man. I met her gaze. If I refuse, war will come sooner. If I accept, it may still come later. Either way, people will die. And us? She asked. I don't know, I said. I don't know what would become of us. That was the most honest answer I had ever given anyone. We were interrupted by footsteps at the chapel entrance. Lord Halric stood there, hands folded, observing us as though we were a scene in a play written for his benefit. Forgive me, he said, but His Majesty wishes to see Lady Isolde. Her shoulders stiffened. She rose, composed once more. As she passed him, Halric inclined his head. You carry a great responsibility, he told her. Few are given such importance. She said nothing. When she was gone, he turned to me. You grow attached, he observed. I grow human, I replied. He smiled. Humanity is dangerous in rulers. So is ambition without restraint. His eyes sharpened. Careful. Or what? I asked. You will advise my father against me? I advise only what is best for the realm, he said smoothly. If that aligns with you, I am your ally. If not... He let the sentence trail off. That night, Elaine came to me again. They are moving pieces, she said. I hear things. Servants hear things. Halric meets with messengers at odd hours. From where? I asked. The east, she whispered, and from within our own court. Fear surged. If father knew... Father trusts him, she interrupted. Too much. I took her hands. You must be careful. So must you, she said, because if this goes wrong, they will not blame Halric. They will blame you. She was right. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was a shadow stretching across every decision, every relationship, and at its center stood a man who smiled too easily and spoke too reasonably, shaping the future with quiet precision. I began to understand that the greatest danger was not the armies beyond our borders. It was the enemy seated at our table. War announces itself long before the first blade is drawn. It arrives in tightened voices, in messengers who stop meeting your eyes, in the way maps are unrolled more often, their edges worn thin by anxious hands. By the time Act 4 unfolded, the palace no longer pretended that peace was stable. It was merely postponed. Troops were reported near the eastern hills, not marching, waiting. Villages sent petitions pleading for protection. Grain prices rose. The city gates closed earlier each night, and still no declaration came. That was the most terrifying part. I was invited to councils that did not record minutes, meetings held at dawn or long after midnight, when decisions could be made without witnesses. My presence was symbolic, my silence expected. Lord Halric thrived in this uncertainty. He spoke of preparedness, of decisive action, of the danger of appearing divided. He spoke often of me, even when I was seated beside my father. The people need to see unity, he said during one such gathering, a clear line of succession, a prince who understands sacrifice. I understood exactly what he meant. My father said little, but when he did, his words carried finality. Orders were given quietly, garrisons reinforced, messages sent to allies whose loyalty was measured in coin and fear. I watched him age in weeks. One night I found him alone in the throne room, seated not on the throne itself, but on the lower steps before it. The crown rested beside him, untouched. You avoid sleep, I said. So do you, he replied. I sat near him, careful not to appear familiar in a space that discouraged intimacy. Did you ever doubt? I asked. He did not look at me. Every day. Then why do you trust Halric so completely? That made him turn. Because he has never failed this crown, my father said. Because when others hesitated, he acted. Because he understands that sentiment has no place in survival. And if his loyalty is not what it seems. My father's expression hardened. That is fear speaking. Fear can be accurate, I said. He stood then, towering, his voice low. Enough. You see shadows because you are afraid to choose. Or because someone wants me blind, I replied. His hand struck the arm of the throne, the sound echoing. You will not undermine my counsel. I am trying to protect this realm, I said, from within. His gaze softened just slightly. Then do what is required. That was his answer to everything. Isolde was moved to more guarded quarters shortly thereafter, officially for her safety, in truth, to limit her influence on me. I was no longer allowed to see her alone. When we did meet, it was across crowded halls or during formal dinners, surrounded by nobles whose smiles masked curiosity. Our conversations were reduced to polite phrases, coded glances, silences that spoke louder than words. Once as we passed each other in a corridor, she brushed her fingers against mine. The touch was brief, barely noticeable. It felt like defiance. The eastern border erupted 3 days later. Not a full invasion. A strike. Villages burned. A garrison overrun. Enough blood to demand response, not enough to justify total war. Halric presented the news to the council with grave composure. This is exactly what we feared, he said. A test. They expect us to hesitate. And the marriage? One lord asked. Would it still? It must happen now, Halric said. Immediately. Delay will be interpreted as weakness. My father looked at me. Every eye followed. This war can still be contained, Halric continued, but only if we act decisively. The Union would signal our strength and force the Eastern Lords to retreat or expose themselves fully. And if they do neither? I asked. Then we fight, Halric said, but from a position of moral authority. I saw then how perfectly arranged this was, the timing, the pressure, the narrative already written. My father dismissed the council early. He asked me to stay. You will do this, he said quietly once we were alone, for the realm. And if I refuse? He closed his eyes briefly. Then you will force my hand. I felt something fracture inside me. You would disinherit me. I would, he said, if it meant stability. The words did not shock me. They simply confirmed what I had always known. That night I stood outside Isolde's chambers, guarded by 2 men who did not meet my gaze. I dismissed them with a gesture they could not refuse. She opened the door herself. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. She looked exhausted, pale, braver than she should have had to be. They will ask me tomorrow, she said. Yes. And you? I will be expected to answer as well. She stepped aside, letting me enter. The room was modest by palace standards, stripped of personal touches, as though she were already being erased. They say the war has begun, she said. It has not, I replied. Not fully. But it will, she said, whether we marry or not. I did not argue. If I accept, she continued, I become a symbol, a threat to my own family. If you refuse, I said, they may declare your house disloyal. She laughed softly, bitterly. So either way, we lose something. I reached for her hand, stopping just short. If there were another path, there is not, she said gently, not one that spares everyone. We stood close again, too close for propriety, too close for safety. I was taught, she said, that love was weakness, that it distracted rulers from duty. And now? I asked, and now I believe it is the only thing that makes the sacrifice unbearable. I took her hand then, properly, firmly. If we do this, I said, it will not be because we were coerced. She met my gaze. Then why? Because I refuse to let Halric decide the story, I said, or anyone else. Her eyes widened slightly. You think he is behind this? I think he has shaped it, I said, and I think the war serves him as much as the realm. She squeezed my hand. Be careful. I already am not. The next morning, before the council convened, Elaine came to me in tears. They are arresting men, she said. Eastern sympathizers, they say. Some are innocent. Who ordered it, I asked, though I already knew. Halric, she said, in father's name. Rage surged, hot and dangerous. This is how it begins, she whispered. They will need someone to blame. I held her close. Stay out of sight, say nothing. And you? I will speak, I said. The council was tense. Armed guards lined the walls. The air felt sharp. Halric presented the arrests as necessary precautions. My father did not contradict him. When the question of marriage was raised, all eyes turned to me. I stood. I will agree, I said, my voice steady. But not under these conditions. Murmurs rippled. I will not have Lady Isolde used as leverage against her family, I continued. Nor will I accept a union built on threat and fear. Halric's smile faded. Your Highness misunderstands the nature of... I understand it perfectly, I said, and I refuse it. The chamber erupted. My father stared at me in disbelief. This marriage, I said, will be presented as a bond of unity, not coercion. Any harm to her family will be considered an act of treason against the crown itself. Halric's eyes were cold now. You overstep. I claim my future, I replied. For a moment, I thought my father would stop me, that he would strip me of my title then and there. Instead, he said nothing. The silence was not approval. It was calculation. The council adjourned in chaos. As I left, Halric's voice followed me. You think you have won something, he said quietly. You have only declared yourself. That night, the Eastern armies moved again. The shadow of war lengthened, no longer content to wait. And I knew that whatever choice I had made, it had set something irreversible in motion. The collapse does not come as a scream, it comes as exhaustion. By the time Act 5 began, I no longer felt fear as a sharp sensation. It had settled into my bones, dull and constant, like an old wound that never healed correctly. Every corridor felt narrower, every conversation felt like a test I was failing in slow motion. The palace changed its rhythm. Servants spoke less. Guards doubled at every entrance. Letters arrived sealed in black wax. Names of fallen villagers were spoken in council as numbers, stripped of faces, stripped of grief. And my name was spoken differently now, not with certainty, with caution. My father avoided me. When we did meet, it was formal, brief, as though he were already practicing how to rule without me, or how to remember me if I fell out of favor. The man who had once corrected my posture and guided my hand across maps now spoke to me as he did to other lords, measured, guarded. I understood then that I had not merely challenged Halric. I had challenged the system my father had surrendered to long ago. Isolde and I were permitted to see each other once more before any official announcement. It was presented as courtesy. In truth, it felt like an inspection. Guards waited outside the chamber. The door remained open. Still, when she entered, the world narrowed to her presence. You look tired, she said. So do you. She smiled faintly. That is what responsibility does, I'm told. We sat across from each other, a table between us like a reminder of distance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. They are preparing the announcement, she said finally. They want it before the next council, before the Eastern Lords move again. Yes, and after that, she continued, I will no longer belong to myself. The words struck deeper than accusation. You will not be alone, I said. She met my gaze. That is not the same thing. She was right. I stood and crossed the room, ignoring the watching eyes beyond the door. I lowered my voice. If I could stop this, I said, I would. "I know," she replied. "That is what makes it bearable." She reached for my hand, and this time I did not hesitate. Her grip was firm, grounding. "Listen to me," she said. "Whatever happens next, you must survive it." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then spoke with careful clarity. "There are rumors that if the war worsens, someone will need to answer for the unrest, for the division in court." "Someone like me," I said. "Someone visible," she agreed. "Someone who challenged the council." I thought of Halrich's smile, of the way narratives were shaped. "They will not dare," I said, though the words felt thin. She tightened her grip. "They will, if it protects the crown." After she left, I remained standing, staring at the door long after it closed. That night I learned of the executions. 3 men, accused of passing information to the East. No trial, no defense. Their families were not informed until after. The order bore my father's seal, but Elaine told me the truth. "He didn't write it," she said, her face pale. "Halrich drafted it. Father only signed." I felt something tear loose inside me. "This has to stop," I said. Elaine shook her head. "You don't have the power." "Not yet," I replied. She grabbed my arm. "That's exactly what frightens him." I confronted my father at dawn. He was already awake, dressed as though he had not slept at all. When I demanded answers, he listened in silence. "Did you know," I asked, "about the executions?" "Yes," he said, "and you allowed it." "I sanctioned it," he corrected, "because the alternative was worse." "Worse for whom?" "For the realm." "For Halrich," I said. His eyes flashed. "You accuse too freely." "I accuse because people are dying," I replied, "and you are letting him decide who is necessary to lose." He turned away from me. "You think I do not see the cost? You think this does not haunt me?" "Then stop," I said. He faced me again, his expression weary beyond anger. "I cannot, not now." "Because you are afraid," I said softly. The word landed heavily between us. He did not deny it. "Fear keeps the realm alive," he said. "Fear of chaos, fear of weakness." "And what of fear of becoming a tyrant?" I asked. His voice dropped. "That fear comes later." I realized then that my father had crossed a line long ago, one he no longer knew how to step back from. The marriage announcement was made at midday. The hall was filled with nobles dressed in their finest, their expressions solemn, expectant. Isolde stood beside me, her posture flawless, her face composed. When my father spoke of unity, of peace, of sacrifice for the greater good, the words echoed hollowly in my ears. When Halrich spoke of strength, of decisive action, I felt the crowd lean toward him, drawn by certainty. When I spoke, my voice did not waver. I spoke of shared futures, of mutual respect, of choosing stability not through fear, but through trust. Some listened, others watched Halrich. That night, alone at last, the weight of it all descended. I sat in my chambers, the walls closing in, my thoughts racing with consequences I could no longer control. Every path I had taken led here, every compromise, every refusal, every moment of hesitation. I had tried to walk between duty and conscience. I was failing both. A knock came at my door. I expected Elaine. It was Halrich. He did not wait for permission to enter. "You are unraveling," he said calmly. "You are poisoning this court," I replied. He smiled slightly. "Strong words from a man who cannot stop what is coming." "What do you want?" I asked. He stepped closer. "I want you to understand something. This war will happen, with or without your marriage, with or without your objections. And yet you push it forward," I said. "Because war reshapes power," he replied, "and reshaping is long overdue." Adud, the truth struck like ice. "You benefit," I said, "from chaos." "I benefit from clarity," he corrected. And so will the realm, once the weak are removed. And who decides who is weak? I asked. He met my gaze unflinching. History. You are not history yet, I said. He leaned closer. Neither are you. After he left, I broke. Not loudly, not visibly. I sank to the floor, my back against cold stone, my breath shallow. The future I had been raised for pressed down on me with unbearable weight. Power without love, duty without mercy, legacy built on quiet graves. For the first time I allowed myself to consider the unthinkable, that I might have to choose between my father and my crown, between the realm as it was and the realm it could become, between Isolde's life and the illusion of peace. There was no version of this story where everyone survived. The war outside the walls was approaching its peak, but the war within me had already reached its breaking point. The moment of no return rarely arrives with certainty. It arrives when hesitation finally costs more than action. By the time Act 6 unfolded, the palace was no longer pretending to be whole. Reports from the east confirmed what Halric had wanted all along. The border conflict had become full war. Armies were no longer testing, they were advancing. Villages burned openly now. Refugees crowded the city gates, carrying grief like a second skin. And still Halric smiled. The council convened in emergency session. Armed guards lined the walls, not for protection from the enemy, but from dissent within. That was when I understood how completely power had shifted. Halric spoke first. The Eastern Lords have declared open rebellion, he said. They march under the banner of independence, claiming the crown has betrayed them. A murmur rose. And Lady Isolde's family? Someone asked. Halric did not look at me when he answered. They have failed to condemn the rebellion. My blood ran cold. That does not mean they support it, I said. In war, Halric replied, silence is allegiance. My father remained still, his face carved from stone. He had aged years in days. What are you proposing? The High Marshal asked. Halric folded his hands. We make an example. We strike their stronghold, publicly, decisively. And we place responsibility where it belongs. The room understood him immediately. No, I said. Halric finally turned to me. You object? You would slaughter a house bound to this crown by marriage, I said. By my word. You have not yet married, he replied calmly. And even if you had, loyalty to the realm supersedes all personal bonds. I rose to my feet. This is treason, I said. Not theirs. Yours. Gasps followed. My father's voice cut through the chamber. Enough. I turned to him. This ends now. He looked at me as though seeing a stranger. Sit down. No, I said. I will not. Halric stepped forward. Your Highness is exhausted. Grief has clouded his judgment. My judgment is clear, I said. You orchestrated this war. Laughter rippled, uneasy. You arranged provocations. You delayed responses. You fed both sides just enough fear to make conflict inevitable, I continued. And now you profit from it. Careful, Halric said. Accusations require proof. I have it, I replied. Elaine stepped forward then, pale but steady. She held sealed letters in her hands. I intercepted messengers, she said, with the help of men who still believe in this crown. She placed the letters on the council table. They bear Lord Halric's seal, she said. Correspondence with Eastern commanders, instructions, promises. The chamber erupted. Halric's smile vanished. These are forgeries, he said sharply. They are not, I replied. And you know it. My father stood slowly. Halric, he said, his voice hollow. Is this true? For a moment I thought Halric might deny it again. Instead, he straightened. Yes, he said, it is. Silence fell like a blade. I did what you could not, Halric continued, "what you were too weak to do. This realm has stagnated under fear of change. War forces evolution." "You manipulated me," my father said. "I guided you," Halric corrected, "as I have for decades." My father looked at him with something like horror. "You used my son." Halric turned to me. "You were always a variable, an inconvenient one." Guards moved forward. "Arrest him," my father said. Halric did not resist. He only smiled at me as he was seized. "You think this ends something," he said softly. "It begins it." That was when the messenger arrived. He burst into the chamber, bloodied, breathless. "The eastern stronghold has fallen," he said. "Your orders were carried out at dawn." My heart stopped. "What orders?" I demanded. The messenger looked to my father. "The strike, authorized last night." I turned slowly. My father could not meet my gaze. "You knew," I said. "I believed it was necessary," he said, "before the proof was complete." "And Isolde's family?" I asked. The messenger swallowed. "None survived." The world narrowed to a single, unbearable point. I felt something inside me die. The council dissolved into chaos, but I heard none of it. I left the chamber without permission, without escort, moving as though through water. I found Isolde in the private courtyard where we had once spoken of fear. She already knew. She stood still, her face emptied of expression, her hands stained with ash from the burned letters she held. "I begged them," she said quietly. "I begged your father." I could not speak. "They were unarmed," she continued. "My brothers, my mother." I fell to my knees before her. "This was not your choice," she said, "but it was done in your name." "I will end this war," I said hoarsely. "I swear it." She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I understood what I had lost. "There are wars that do not end," she said. "They only change shape." That night, I confronted my father one final time. "You crossed a line," I said, "and I cannot follow you any further." He looked broken. "I did what I thought would save us." "You destroyed us," I replied. "I am still king," he said. "Not for long," I answered. At dawn, I stood before the council and claimed the regency, not with ceremony, with necessity. My father did not resist, he did not argue, he simply removed the crown and placed it in my hands. The weight nearly crushed me. Halric was executed before nightfall. The war did not end, but the story could no longer be shaped by lies. I had chosen, not love, not innocence, but truth, and there was no turning back. Consequences do not arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, deliberately, as though time itself wishes to ensure that every loss is felt. When Act 7 began, the crown rested on my head, but it did not feel earned. It felt inherited from ruin. The regency was declared in my name before the city could fully understand what had changed. Official statements spoke of transition, of stability, of decisive leadership in a time of war. None of them spoke of Isolde's family. None of them spoke of the bodies left unburied beyond the eastern hills. My father withdrew from public life immediately. He was not imprisoned. That mercy was my decision, and it haunted me more than punishment would have. He remained in the palace, confined to his chambers, a living monument to choices that could not be undone. When we passed each other in corridors, we did not speak. We did not need to. The war shifted in tone after Halric's death. It did not end, but it lost its false clarity. Commanders no longer spoke with certainty. Orders were questioned. For the first time, generals asked what victory was meant to look like. That question had no answer. I spent my days in councils and my nights with maps spread across my chambers, tracing borders that had already been redrawn in blood. Every decision carried weight. Every delay carried cost. I learned quickly that power does not grant peace of mind. It only removes the illusion of ignorance. Elaine stood beside me throughout it all. She became my shadow, my conscience, my anchor. Where others flattered, she warned. Where others demanded, she questioned. Many in court resented her presence. A woman with no official authority whispering into the ear of a regent. I allowed it, because she had been right when others were comfortable being wrong. "You cannot save everyone," she told me one night after a council dissolved into argument. "But you must decide who you refuse to sacrifice." That became my only rule. Isolde did not attend court. She remained in her chambers for weeks, refusing invitations, refusing comfort. When she did appear, it was only to arrange the burial rites for her family. I attended from a distance unannounced, standing among shadows, as prayers were spoken over names that would never answer again. She did not look at me. I did not blame her. The people reacted slowly to my rule. Some welcomed the removal of Halric, whispering that justice had finally found its way into the palace. Others blamed me openly. They said my defiance had weakened the crown, that my hesitation had invited chaos. They were not entirely wrong. Rebellions do not dissolve when their architect dies. They fragment, they spread. Smaller conflicts ignited along the borders, fueled by grief, vengeance, and opportunity. Each demanded response. Each response demanded more blood. One evening, a general presented me with a strategy that would end the Eastern resistance within months. It required burning the remaining strongholds, starving the countryside into submission. "It will shorten the war," he said, "and save lives in the long run." I looked at the map, at the villages, at the roads refugees would have used. "No," I said. He stared at me. "Then this war will drag on." "Then it will drag on," I replied. "But it will not be remembered as extermination." He bowed stiffly and left. That night, I finally went to Isolde. I stood outside her door for a long time before knocking. When she opened it, she did not look surprised, only tired. "I am not here to ask forgiveness," I said. She studied my face, searching for something. "Good," she replied. "I have none to give. I am here to tell you that I will not use this war as an excuse to become him." Her gaze hardened. "That does not bring them back." "No," I said, "but it may prevent others from joining them." She stepped aside, allowing me in. The room was bare, almost monastic. She had stripped it of color. "They speak your name differently now," she said. "Some curse it, some praise it." "And you?" I asked. She looked away. "I do not know who you are yet." "That is fair," I said. We stood in silence, not the comfortable kind we once shared, but one weighted with irreparable truth. "I will not force you to stand beside me," I said. "In court or in history." She nodded slowly. "That may be the first honest act of power I have seen." Loss changed everything. It changed how people looked at me. It changed how I spoke. It changed the way the crown felt on my head. It was no longer a symbol of destiny. It was a reminder of cost. My father fell ill that winter. Whether from age, grief, or the slow realization of what he had done, no one could say. When I was told he would not recover, I went to him. He looked small in his bed, not like a king, not even like a ruler, just a man who had believed fear was the only language power understood. "I thought I was protecting you," he said weakly. "I know," I replied. "I made you into this," he whispered. "No," I said. "You made the crown into this. I chose what to do with it." Tears filled his eyes. "I am sorry," he said. It was the first apology he had ever given me. He died before dawn. The kingdom mourned him as a strong ruler. History would likely remember him kindly. History rarely sees the private rooms where decisions rot before they are announced. I ordered a restrained funeral. No triumph, No glorification, just remembrance. As his pyre burned, I understood fully what it meant to inherit a legacy. You do not receive it whole. You receive it broken, and you decide which fractures to carry forward. The war continued, but it no longer belonged to men like Halric. It belonged to me now, and I would have to live with whatever shape I gave it. Legacy is not what remains when the war ends. It is what survives inside those who must live after it. By the time Act 8 unfolded, the war had thinned into something quieter. Not peace, never that, but exhaustion. The kind that dulls hatred and forces even the most vengeful to sit down and count what is left. Borders stabilized, not because of victory, but because no one could afford further loss. I ruled through that fragile stillness, not as a conqueror, not as a savior, simply as someone who refused to look away. The crown no longer felt foreign on my head, but it never felt natural either. I learned to carry it the way one carries grief, with awareness, with restraint, with the understanding that if I moved too quickly, it would pull me under. The people learned me slowly. Some never forgave me for what happened to Isolde's family. Others praised me for ending Halric's influence and halting the worst of the war's cruelty. Most simply watched, waiting to see what kind of ruler fear would shape me into. Fear did not leave me. It matured. It taught me patience. It taught me that power is loud only when it is insecure, that true authority speaks rarely and listens often, that the temptation to rule through force is strongest when one feels least in control. Elaine remained at my side, though she refused all titles. She said proximity to power was dangerous enough, without names attached to it. In time, the court learned to respect her presence, not because she demanded it, but because I did. "You will be remembered," she told me once as we stood watching the city lights flicker below the palace walls. "For what?" I asked. She did not answer immediately. "For not becoming him." It was not praise. It was relief. Isolde left the palace in early spring, not in disgrace, not in secrecy. She asked for land far from the capital, far from borders, far from memory. A place where her name carried no weight and no threat. I granted it without conditions. We spoke once before she departed. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "I know," I replied. She studied me with eyes that no longer searched for reassurance. "I believe you wanted to be better than the crown." "And failed," I said. "No," she replied. "You succeeded. That is why this hurts." She did not stay. She did not forgive, but she did not curse me either. That was the truest mercy I was given. In the years that followed, I rebuilt not monuments, but systems, councils with limits, advisors whose power depended on consensus rather than proximity, laws that could not be bent by a single voice, even mine. Some called it weakness. Others called it the beginning of something dangerous. I called it necessary. At night, when the palace grew quiet, I sometimes walked the same corridors I had as a child. The portraits still watched from the walls, their expressions unchanged. Kings, queens, conquerors, strategists, all remembered for what they took or defended. I wondered how many of them had stood where I stood, terrified not of enemies, but of themselves. I was raised for power. That much was true. Every lesson, every silence, every withheld affection had shaped me for command. But I had not been raised for love, and that absence left its mark more deeply than any wound. Yet love did not disappear simply because it was denied. It changed form. It became restraint when I could have destroyed. It became mercy when punishment would have been easier. It became the refusal to let fear write the final chapter of my rule. The war would be remembered as inevitable, as all wars are. Historians would debate causes and victories, names and dates. They would not write about Isolde's hands trembling as she burned letters from her dead family. They would not write about my father's apology whispered too late. They would not write about the nights I sat alone, wondering whether the crown had cost me my humanity or preserved it. That was not their task. It was mine. I no longer believe a ruler can be good, only deliberate, only accountable, only aware of the damage his choices will leave behind. When I think now of legacy, I do not think of bloodlines or statues or songs. I think of Elaine standing unafraid in rooms built to silence her. I think of Isolde walking away with her dignity intact. I think of a kingdom that survived, not because it was strong, but because it learned briefly to be careful. I was raised for power, not for love. But I learned, too late and at great cost, that power without love becomes cruelty, and love without power becomes tragedy. So I chose something else: responsibility. And if history remembers me at all, I hope it is not as a hero or a tyrant, but as a ruler who understood that fear must be carried, not obeyed, because fear will always exist. The difference is whether we let it rule us, or whether we learn to rule in spite of it.